I remember the day my son walked out of my life as if it were a photograph caught mid-breath, sharp, impossible to breathe around. He kissed my forehead like he always had, soft and automatic, then turned away with a suitcase and a smile that had already been rehearsed. He told me it was for work, that he would visit, that everything would be fine. I believed him because believing felt safer than asking the questions that would have changed everything. For years after, letters thinned into phone calls, and phone calls thinned into silence. The house grew quieter in ways I couldn't name. Rooms holding their breath, chairs learning the shape of absence. I told myself he was busy, he had a life to build. I folded my loneliness into practical things. Doctor appointments, the small victories of remembering names and dates, the ritual of making tea for one. I did not expect to be the kind of woman who would be forgotten. There were signs I missed, blame I assigned to the wrong hours. He began to leave things out. A plate unwashed, a jacket on a chair, the way he stopped mentioning plans he once loved. I thought, foolishly, they were stops on the road to adulthood. It is hard to teach yourself to recognize absence in progress. Absence is a thief with a talent for disguise. We adapt daily until one morning you find your home has less of someone in it than it did the day before. I read his favorite book so I could feel near him, made him meals and left the porch light burning on nights I thought he'd return. I collected small things that smelled like him, a sweater, a coffee mug, and pretended they were enough. When my health made the house a danger rather than a comfort, my daughter, bless her stubborn, kind heart, talked to me like someone discussing logistics, not endings. We looked at care facilities together. I signed the papers with her hand steady on mine. I felt shame then, a private collapse that didn't want witnesses. My son did not visit that week or the next or the month after. I called once, twice, 3 times until my voice became a strain on the line. He always had an excuse. A new contract, a problem with the bank, an engagement that couldn't be missed. Time kept a ledger, and somehow he kept writing himself out of my entries. It isn't dramatic at first. It is small betrayals, tiny omissions that build a house of distance you can't see until you're trapped inside it. The nursing home smelled of lemon cleaner and memories that weren't mine. At first, I treated the days like an adventure gone wrong. I made friends with the television schedule, and the nurse who liked to tell me about her children. I learned to wear sweaters that hid the lines of my wrists, and to smile when family came to visit. It's easier sometimes to train yourself into routine than to stand against the tide of disappointment. Months slid into seasons. My son's name stopped appearing in the visitor log. Birthdays came and went with cardless envelopes. I wasn't angry at first, I was bewildered. Anger is a fine thing, it gives the heart a place to go. But bewilderment sits like fog and makes the world unreliable. Then the letter arrived. On a morning I had folded my hair into a bun and placed the kettle on the stove. It was not from him but from a lawyer I had never heard of. The paper hummed with the kind of authority that makes your hands go cold. A request for my signature, only mine, on a document authorizing the sale of a piece of our family land. Land that had been in our family for generations. A small field where my husband had taught my son to fish, where we had buried a red bicycle and buried a piece of ourselves. The lawyer's handwriting was precise, polite. The request was brisk. My signature, a witness, and an urgency that smelled faintly of steam and calculation. When I called, my son's voice was warm, friendly, surprised that I didn't already know. "It's just paperwork, Ma," he said. "I need you to sign." I read the lines twice, then 3 times. The room spun, not from the kettle but from the way my life had been turned into a footnote in someone else's ledger. For a moment absurdity flared. Was this a test? A joke? My mind wanted to find a humane explanation for the cruelty I felt. It gave me a map with a single route. I could sign, be brushed off and forgotten again, or I could do something small and dangerous, something that would make him see the edges he had been stepping over. I called my daughter. She listened. Her hands trembled even through the phone. "You don't have to, Mom," she said. "You don't owe him your consent. He's the one who forgot you." So there it was, the question that would decide my weight in his life. I went to the meeting with the lawyer because I wanted to understand the shape of what he wanted. The room smelled of leather and coffee. My son sat across the table with an expression that was practiced concern, as if he had learned the right way to look repentant under fluorescent lights. He explained how the sale would help him, his voice smooth with entitlement. Mortgages, investments, the word opportunity, thrown like a confetti to make grief festive. I watched him talk and realized that his need for my signature wasn't about me at all. It was about the last loose seam tying him to the past. Signing would make the sale clean. Signing would mean my name, like the ink, could be crossed out without him lifting a finger. When I saw his jaw set, the polite mouth working like a machine, I felt a heat inside me that had nothing to do with the room temperature. My reply was quiet, which made it sharper. "I won't sign," I said. It surprised even me how calm the words were. There were other things I could do. I might have raged, called his partners, or exposed him publicly, but I knew that vengeance that burns bridges for the sake of fire is cheap and empty. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he had chosen, not to be humiliated in front of strangers. "I won't sign," I repeated, "unless you sit down with me like a son, not an accountant." He blinked, as if I had asked him to do something physically taxing. He argued, "It's just business, Ma. We'll settle this later." My refusal was a small rebellion, a seam pulled so the fabric might change shape. After the meeting, he left in a hurry. The drive home felt long, a road unspooling beneath a car that carried the sound of my decision. In the weeks that followed, he tried other tactics. Calls in the afternoon when I might be asleep, messages full of the right kinds of remorse, promises to visit and help with the things he never helped with. Each attempt was like a bandage on a wound that needed a different kind of tending. I had no desire to be cruel for cruelty's sake. I wanted him to reckon with the absence he had authored. I made myself small in his life on purpose, not to plead but to reveal a truth. Absence has consequences. He had built a life that assumed forgiveness as its foundation. I made him rebuild the ground he stood on. Neighbors started asking questions when he didn't show up, and the calls became less convincing. Rumors are a sort of currency, and I decided to spend mine where it mattered. I arranged for the lawyer to send a formal note explaining my refusal and asking that any future dealings be postponed until there was a fuller conversation. I wrote a letter to my son, and I sent it not as a plea but as a ledger of memory. Details of small private moments only I could have kept. The way he used to whistle while washing dishes, the time he cried when the puppy ran away. I wrote so he would recognize the human being behind the signature line. The letter was quiet. It was the kind of weapon that doesn't break bones but breaks the other things people hide behind. Convenience and assumption. He came back, not with triumph but with a fatigue that looked like panic. He sat in the same wooden chair with his hands folded, like a man performing a penance he had not earned. "Why would you make me do this?" he asked, voice small and worn. He hadn't expected refusal to land like a stone he couldn't swallow. I could have told him then about all the times I waited by the window, about the birthdays you forgot to remember, about the nights I dreamed he would come back and stand at my door. Instead I said, "Do you remember the field by the river? The way you taught me to throw stones so they'd hug the water? That field is not just land. It is where we taught each other how to be alive." He tried to bargain. He said he would visit more, that he would sign after we had a family meeting, that he would give me money, or sell to someone who would honor the family. His words were the thin currency of the desperate. "You want a promise," I said. "But promises without proof are like empty rooms. They echo but hold nothing." I told him that I would consider signing only after he had spent time here, really been present, and taken steps to repair what he'd left behind. It was a demand, yes, but not a cruel one. I asked him to remember to look people in the face and match his lips to what his hands did. That was my small revenge and my test. Make him come back to the slow, unglamorous work of being human. For weeks he came, or so he said. Sometimes he stayed an afternoon, sometimes a night. There were awkward dinners, grocery runs where he fumbled with coupons, and quiet mornings where he apprenticed himself back into our life like someone learning a craft. He read the newspaper aloud when my eyes tripped on the small print and learned to remember birthdays not as dates but as days people felt seen. I watched carefully. Trust, once broken, rebuilds like a wall whose mortar must be mixed from time and truth, not from excuses. Slowly the edges softened. He began to ask about my day not as a performance but as a need. He sat with the other residents, learning names and stories he had ignored. He fixed the old fence by the field not to make a show but because he had started to feel the weight of the work. When he finally asked me again to sign, his voice was steadier, and there was less of that sharp entitlement. I felt something shift in him, like weather clearing after a long storm. I signed eventually, but not on the dotted line he had first offered. We negotiated an arrangement that required him to set aside a portion of the proceeds for the care of elder relatives, to fund a small scholarship for a child in the village, and to promise documented visits for a year. It was a compromise with teeth. It forced him to translate words into habits. He argued, grumbled, and then, with the posture of a man who has been made to change his route, he agreed. The signature felt heavy and honest. It was my lesson turned practical. Sometimes justice is not spectacle but reconstruction. My son had to earn his place back, not buy it with an apology. He learned, clumsily late, that love cannot be signed away without cost. In the weeks after the agreement, there were small things that mattered more than the papers. He came for ordinary Thursdays, sat with me in the garden while I pointed out the names of plants, and learned the ritual of boiling water just right for tea. He stayed for Sunday conversations that used to be reserved for his childhood tales. The neighbors' children learned to wave at him and call him uncle, and sometimes he would stay to watch them hit a ball against the fence. He began to bring the neighbors' groceries in when they could not manage. These were not dramatic rescues, but they added up. People who have lost habit must rebuild it by repetition. His visits were the new mortar between our stones. There were tender missteps too. He would get confused about appointments. He'd apologize for mistakes he made years ago as if confessing sins could mend them at once. He would sit too long thinking and then apologize for sitting too long. A new awkwardness in the body of a man who had once been so quick to leave. My daughter watched this slow return with a relief that was both guarded and earnest. She had dear instincts about the difference between performative remorse and the slow shaping of character. She reminded me often, "This is not about punishment, Ma. It's about asking for repair." There were moments of tenderness that surprised me. An awkward hand on my knee the first time he tried being gentle. A morning when he read the garden notes back to me and found the little errors I'd made without telling. Not all of his attempts were honest. Some were rehearsed, some were self-interested. But the heart cannot be judged only by its beginnings. You must watch where it goes. I learned to observe without letting my own grief steer my judgment. His evolution was a clumsy, beautiful thing. He stumbled into decency and then had to practice being there. My daughter supported me with an economy of kindness that felt like currency. She took care of the paperwork, of the phone calls my voice could not manage. She would come in the evenings and hum songs I'd forgotten to remember. There is a fierce tenderness in people who stand by you when the world looks away. She reminded me that strength sits beside softness. One does not cancel the other. It was her voice that suggested the scholarship, the part of the sale that would feed the future rather than merely fill pockets. It was her idea that my signature could be conditional, not a withhold of love but a demand for accountability. The neighbors finally learned there was trouble, but they came not with scandal but with small acts. A pie on the stoop, a cup of sugar, a call to check on my prescriptions. Community does not always arrive loudly. It arrives like a hand at the right time. They watched the way my son moved through the house, at first like a visitor with a borrowed script, later like a man inhabiting his own lines. People noticed patterns, and when he began to show up, they nodded politely and said nothing. Some of them watched him with skepticism, others with relief. I felt both because I am not simple in the way I judge my child. There is a strange pilgrimage you make when reclaiming respect. It begins with something small, a refusal and insistence, and then demands you keep your feet in that place of strength until the change completes itself. It is boring work as much as brave. It requires you to be consistent and weary-proof, to do the same small thing 100 times because each repetition is a brick. People romanticize dramatic confrontations, but most real-life reckonings are built in fluorescent-lit rooms and paper-stacked corners, by people who refuse to let the matter rest. I am not naive. I know that some people will never return, that wounds sometimes calcify and become the map of a life. Maybe his discovery was late. Maybe the cost was necessary for him to step back from the life he built without roots. But I also know that sometimes, with insistence and love, people can replant themselves. My small revenge hoped for that. It demanded he prove his presence not with grand gestures but with the slow, unsexy work of showing up. If you find yourself abandoned, know that you have the right to set terms that protect your dignity. There were nights I lay awake and measured the cost in small minutes. The time I spent walking to the window hoping to see a silhouette, the hours making soup that cooled untouched, the afternoons I chose to read his old school reports to remember the cadence of his handwriting. Pain has a way of adding up quietly. But there is also a counterweight, the grace of surviving shame and translating it into clarity. I discovered a muscle in myself I'd never known. The ability to separate love from obligation, tenderness from tolerance. I found the courage to say no in service of meaning, and through that no, I taught a lesson that required him to do the hard thing, to rebuild. So if you find yourself in the place I once occupied, waiting for a child, a partner, a friend to remember the contract of love, do not mistake patience for passivity. You can be both loving and firm. Set terms that ask for restoration, not spectacle. Ask for time. Ask for evidence. Ask for small, repeatable acts that mean more than promises. Your life is not a ledger to be balanced by someone else's convenience. Protect your days. Insist that someone earn the right to them. This was my small revenge and my hope, that absence would teach him to be present, that accountability would turn into habit, that the child who once left would one day return and stay because staying had become the only honest option. If my story aches in you, let that ache become action. Call someone you love, say the things that matter, and if you must refuse to sign away your dignity, do it with the quiet, steady courage of someone who believes in repair. Teach presence. Demand it. And when people come back, make them stay by the work they are willing to do. That is the victory I wanted, and in the slow, patient days that followed, it came to us both.